Hello, and welcome to our seventh and last class of our course on Descriptive Data Analysis. In this class, we are going to talk about the normal distribution. We are also going to present the association measures, and finally, we are going to present the linear regression as a tool to model the relationship between one dependent variable and one or more independent variables. We started this course presenting the frequency distribution of variables. We studied how to plot the distributions using the histogram, and then we discussed a number of summary measures that allow us to numerically quantify important measures related with the data distribution. During the course, we've seen many different shapes of frequency distributions. We saw more uniform distributions, we saw more peaked, more steep, flatter distributions with long tails to one side or to another side or to both sides. All of them represent different variables and different phenomena. However, there is one particular type of distribution, which is this bell-shaped distribution that requires and that has a special treatment. This distribution is called the normal distribution. The normal distribution has many features that are remarkable. One of them is that it is symmetric in relation to its mean. It also has tails on both sides. Let's have a deeper look into the normal distribution. This figure here is showing three normal distributions plotted with different values for their mean and their standard deviation. The first case here, which is the blue curve or the blue distribution, it has a mean of -1 and it has a standard deviation of 0.5. The orange one has a mean of 0 and the standard deviation of 1. This is what we could call as the standard normal distribution, mean 0 and standard deviation 1. And I also plotted here for us a normal distribution with mean 1 and standard deviation 1.5. As we have already studied, higher standard deviations result in more spread distributions. If we take the standard normal distribution, we have some interesting properties relating the standard deviation and the number of values that are within these standard deviations. For example, for one standard deviation, we know that 68% of all values fall within this standard deviation. We also know that approximately 95% of the values fall within two standard deviations and 99.7% of the values fall within three standard deviations. These relative positions in relation to the standard deviation is very interesting for the analysis of normal distributions. This is one way of defining an outlier in your analysis. You could be stricter by saying that all values that are greater than 3 standard deviations are outliers, and this means that they occur with a frequency that is less than 0.3% of the frequency of all other values in the distribution. This relationship between the values and the standard deviations gave rise to what became known as the empirical rule 68, 95, 99.7. Examples of phenomena involving normal distributions abound in the world. We have them in biology, in physics, in social systems. For example, the height of human adults in a certain population usually follows a normal distribution. The blood pressure of some individuals in a population also follows a normal distribution. Let us now investigate if there is any type of relationship between variables. These relationships are usually called association. Association measures are those that determine if there is any relationship between variables. If there is, the goal is to determine the strength and the direction of this association. It's very common that the association measures belong to a certain range so that we can relatively compare the association between different variables. We say that two variables are negatively associated or negatively correlated when the increase in one variable promotes a decrease in the other variable, and vice versa. By contrast, they are positively correlated if both of them either increase or decrease simultaneously. The first association measure that we are going to study here is called covariance. Covariance is taken between two variables, x and y, by simply multiplying the difference between each value of the variable and its respective mean. If we take the covariance among all variables in a given dataset, we can generate the covariance matrix. As example, let's consider the case of the forest fire dataset. This matrix here contains the covariance among all variables in this dataset. If we have a quick look at it, we can see that some variables are highly positively covariant. For example, DC and DMC, DC FFMC, DC and IZ, DC and temp. We can also observe that some variables are very negatively covariant. For example, DC and the relative humidity. One problem with the covariance measure is that it is an absolute measure, in the sense that it doesn't allow us to compare the covariance among different pairs of variables, because the covariance does not have one specific range. One form of solving this problem with the covariance measure is by taking the correlation. The correlation is the covariance divided by the product of the standard deviation of each of the variables. By simply taking this division, you normalize the value of the covariance, generating the correlation. And the correlation ranges over the interval -1 to +1, meaning that two variables with a correlation of -1 are highly negatively correlated variables, whilst two variables with a correlation of +1 are variables highly positively correlated. To illustrate, take the case again of the forest fires dataset. When we calculate the correlation between all pairs of variables, the first thing that we can observe here in this matrix is that the correlation between a variable and itself is 1, which is maximal correlation as we expected. And we can also draw some conclusions about some of the variables by looking at this correlation matrix. For example, let's have a look at the case of the variable temperature and the variable relative humidity. This is the largest negative correlation that we have in this table, and this means that the higher the temperature, the smaller the relative humidity, which is somewhat intuitive for us. Higher temperatures implying a smaller humidity in the air. And to conclude our class and our course, let's consider now linear regression. The linear regression is simply a statistical method to calculate the relationship between a dependent variable and one or more independent variables. Here at the bottom, I am showing you the equation of a linear regression for a single variable x. This is represented by the equation y equals to a plus bx. In this equation, y is the dependent variable, x is the independent variable, a is the intercept, that is, the value with which this line crosses the y-axis, and b is the angle that this line makes with the x-axis. To illustrate the relationship between the linear regression and the correlation, let's plot the scatter plot between pairs of variables in the forest fires dataset. Here we have the variables DMC and DC plotting this graph, and we also plotted the linear regression between these two variables. As we can see here, the linear regression has a positive angle, meaning that we have a positive correlation between these two variables. The same thing happened with variables FFMC and IZ, but when we look at the relationship between variables temp and the relative humidity, we see a negative angle between the linear regression and the x-axis, meaning that we have a negative correlation between these two variables. For the variables temperature and wind, we also have a negative correlation here. Looking at variables wind and area, we have no correlation at all because the linear regression makes an angle of approximately 0 with the x-axis. In the case of variables rain and DC, what we can observe is that this outlier in particular makes a huge difference in the calculation of the linear regression. Because if we didn't have this outlier here and these other outliers, the linear regression would be a vertical line here over these points that represent the relationship between rain and DC. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to check the other courses and series that we have in our channel.